You're listening to the Author Inside You podcast, a weekly podcast designed to motivate you to finish writing a book, choose a publisher, and have your work build an audience. Keep listening if you're looking to get propelled into the next chapter of your life. And now, it's the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.
Hello and welcome to the Author Inside You podcast. I'm Matt Rafferty.
And I'm Leah Rafferty.
Joining us today is Bruce Wawrzyniak, author of Bruce's Bonus Book, an ebook series. Bruce is a speaker, podcast host, and author, and president of Now Hear This. His podcast, Now Hear This Entertainment, has over 200 episodes, and he's had some really interesting guests, including Roy Orbison Jr. Bruce, thanks for joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So how did your books come about?
The books came about because my podcast, Now Hear This Entertainment, features a tip in the middle of every episode that I'm giving out deliberately for listeners who are up-and-coming entertainers. And there came a point in time when I realized if someone discovers my podcast, and you figure at this point we're up to 211 episodes, if someone just discovers it now, they're not going to go all the way back to episode 1 because they like the tip and try to put in all the time to listen to every episode that they missed, find where the tip was, what did I say, write it down. So I thought it would be really convenient for them to just have these almost as a workbook, so to speak, to have on hand because it's an ebook. They can just look at it on their phone, on their tablet, and really apply them almost on the spot where they are and have it so that it's at their fingertips when and where they need it. There's a categorical index that they can refer to. So maybe if they're preparing for one thing in particular and they want some advice, they can refer to that. And so that's how the ebook series was birthed.
Well, this sounds like a great idea and it can a companion to your podcast. I would think maybe even bringing in more listeners. So let's say you could probably read this book and it could be applied to any job, right? Because anyone could use helpful
in fact, Leah, a lot of the tips that are in there are more from, say, a promotional standpoint, a marketing standpoint. There are a few things on there that, yes, do have to do with, say, your stage show, for example. But as a nod to Casey Kasem in the old America's Top 40, there are 40 tips in each volume. So far, there's 3 volumes in the ebook series out right now, and volume 4 is in production. But I would say out of those 40, the overwhelming majority of them, yes, as you said, Leah, could be applied across other industries because I'm giving people tips on marketing and promoting themselves. And in the case of my podcast, they happen to be geared towards a listening audience that is entertainers, but that doesn't mean that they don't apply. And the thing that I've really been proud of is that I'm making these tips very practical. I'm not giving out advice that requires people having a huge budget to have these tips be put into place right away. I'm not encouraging people to go out and invest all kinds of money. I'm asking them to invest their own time and interest in growing their career.
Well, that sounds wonderful, especially to our audience, because it seems like a lot of people say the hardest part wasn't the writing of their books, but marketing their books. So it sounds like this book would be beneficial to our listeners.
Indeed, I know that authors look to a publisher and think that the publisher is going to do all the promotion for them. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of the time, the publisher will put the book out for you, and then they'll say what you just said. Now go and promote it.
Mm-hmm. That's what we hear over and over.
Yeah,
exactly.
Difficult.
How about we talk a little bit about the actual ebook itself? Did you use a specific program, or how did you go about writing, like putting it all together?
I'll tell you what, Matt, the beauty of putting out a book the way I have is that it doesn't require all kinds of time insofar as the time was already invested when I originally wrote these tips, when I was writing each and every podcast every week. So this is something that I think your listeners could really benefit from as far as people get burdened by the fact that they think, oh my gosh, I'm going to write a book. This is going to take forever to come up with the content. And in my case, it was a matter of repurposing already existing content. And yes, there's some time that you still need to invest in it. So sitting down at the computer and writing an introduction, writing the index, writing a conclusion, working with someone to design the cover for you, those types of things, yes, they all take time, but it's nowhere near starting from scratch and saying, I'm going to write a fiction novel that is just going to come from my imagination.
Right. Did you end up just using Word to write the book?
I actually did it in Word, but I did it roughly because I knew that I was going to enlist a designer to make the interior pages and the cover, for that matter, look a whole lot better than these ebooks, mind you, are only $4.97 each. At the same time, if someone's going to buy the whole series and spend $15, I want them to get as much value out of the content as they do feel good about downloading this ebook and looking at it and saying, this looks like something that should require money and shouldn't be given away for free. Mm-hmm. So to set it out in Microsoft Word, to me, was just kind of a bridge to get to someone who could do it professionally in terms of what the finished appearance was going to be.
And how did you find the professional to work with?
Honestly, I shopped around, Leah, with some people locally, and for something that is at the end of the day just going to be a $4.97 download for someone, I wasn't willing to invest the kind of money that a designer wants to charge you for a project that doesn't really require the services that they want to apply to you, which would normally be given to a traditional book in a traditional publishing fashion. So I actually went on Fiverr, which hopefully your listeners are familiar with, fiverr.com. That's 5RR. It's FIVERR. And looked through some different designers on there. And although the premise of that website is getting work done for $5, it doesn't cost $5 no. when you're doing a book. That's...
Yeah, yours looks really good. They did a very nice job.
It's probably 45, 46, 47, 48 pages long, each volume. So, of course, that designer, that requires an awful lot of time for them to not only do the cover, but all the interior pages. At the same time, I still knew that the investment was going to be far less than if I went to somebody locally who was going to tell me, okay, my rate starts at $75 an hour, or X amount per page. I thought that's, I'm going to get a great looking product, but I'm going to be able to do it economically. And as I said, when you're only charging $4.97 for an ebook, you're not going to put a huge budget into it that it's going to take an awful lot of downloads to make back.
Did you end up using the same designer for all the volumes?
I did, for consistency's sake, and because I was pleased with the work that he did the first time around. And then it also becomes a familiarity thing. I come back to him and say, it's time for another volume.
Right.
He's familiar with the project already.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you come up with the $4.97 price?
I think that was just in talking to enough people who have done these types of projects and kind of researching what's out there. I also knew that this was going to be something that would grow over time, meaning that there'd end up being multiple volumes in the series. And quite frankly, Matt, I know that musicians don't have a lot of money. And so even though this extends to other industries, my initial target audience was the up and coming musicians. And I thought, if they can't justify spending $5 on their career, or to the point now where it's 3 volumes and it's $15, then maybe they've got bigger problems beyond those that they're trying to solve with my ebook series. But I didn't want to roll out something where it was going to be, $19.95 per book, and all of a sudden you're asking them to spend close to $80.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
What about, did you have an editor, or did you just edit yourself?
Fortunately, I have a real deep background in editing. I used to work in professional sports, and I was always in the PR department. So I was the one that was doing game night programs. I was doing press releases. I was doing team media guides. So I did so much writing over the years that I'm kind of one of those people that will sit there and read the newspaper and find the mistakes that they made in the newspaper. And so when it came to my own book, I was able to save myself an expense there of sending it out to someone else, because I know that the buck stops with me.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a background, your background before you started your company and before the podcast and before the books, you have a background where you do, as a PR person, promote people.
Promote people and do an awful lot of writing and even public speaking, which, leads itself to the beauty of having the ebooks is when I go out and I'm doing a presentation to a group where it's appropriate, I can do a special and say, there's a 3-volume ebook series that I have called Bruce's Bonus Book. And I'll tell them, if you go to brucesbonusbook.com order volume 2 or order volume 3 and put something in the notes section saying that I presented at this event, and I will email you volume 1 for free.
Oh.
So it's a nice thing to be able to do from the stage so that the people have seen you speak in person, they've found value in the presentation that you've just given, and then you tell them, here's additional help that you can get, and as a thank you, I will send you volume 1 for free once I see your order come through for volume 2 or volume 3 or both, as long as you have that item in the notes section.
Oh, that is great.
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah.
Right. Do you promote on social media?
Yes, I'm extremely active on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I do have a YouTube channel, but to me, that's kind of just for, I don't want to say occasional use, but in other words, I have an Instagram account that is just for my podcast, and I post on there 7 days a week. Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I usually will do Facebook and Twitter 5 days a week, meaning Monday through Friday. LinkedIn is probably 4 out of those 5 days. So I'm very active with all of those.
Wow.
And the reason for that is because I recognized early on that a lot of people have kind of a favorite. You know, some people really love Instagram. So if you put all your eggs in the Facebook basket, as I've been heard to say before, then you're missing those people who love Instagram. So it's really, you can't be all things to all people. You can't be everywhere. I've heard a lot of people talk about the fact that businesses really should be taking advantage of Snapchat. I've just kind of drawn the line and said, look, between Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn, I'm in 5 different places already.
Right.
I just can't extend myself to one more, because then someone else will come along and they'll make a case for insert platform here. And, you know, where do you stop?
Sure. And you also have your blog and your podcast.
Right.
Yeah. And the nice thing there is, you know, it's always important to understand where your audience hangs out. So because my podcast is a music podcast, I do have it on SoundCloud in addition to all of the places where you would expect it to be. So musicians really hang out on SoundCloud and will discover my podcast a lot of times because it's over there. And I will see listenership from all over the world on SoundCloud. And I'm not saying that I'm not getting that from iTunes and Stitcher Radio and the others, but I can see clearly that these are musicians who are there. So when I launched my podcast, I made sure that SoundCloud was one of the platforms that I made it available on for that reason.
Oh, good idea. Do you use a program to schedule your social media posts?
I don't, and I'll tell you the reason for that, Matt. There are different platforms that will actually publish as part of your post where it originated from. So if you're using something like Hootsuite, it will say Hootsuite. And to me, that doesn't look authentic.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's good to know.
Someone educated will look at that post and they'll say, well, this guy scheduled this who knows when. He could have set all his posts up for the week on Sunday, and that doesn't really feel as authentic to me. I know other people will say, well, Bruce, it's a real time saver. Yes, I agree. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the way that you can get rid of that is to pay. So the free service, you're going to see that tag on there. I just as soon do it myself. And I don't want to say customize it, but it kind of bothers me when people automate their posts across several platforms, because, for instance, you'll see a post on Twitter that really is just someone's Facebook post, and it looks kind of clumsy with a link in there. So I'd rather be able to just freehand it myself and say specific to each platform, and, you know, leverage hashtags and things like that.
That seems like a good tip.
Right. That seems like a good idea to avoid Hootsuite unless you're going to pay for the more expensive version. Can I get back into the nuts and bolts of publishing the ebook? When you when somebody clicks on your webpage and decides to buy it, is that a service that you subscribe to for that? Or do you just get an email and then you send them the PDF and you just answer each email that comes in?
Fortunately, my web developer has set up the website so that we can do it all in-house, so that it is automated in the fashion that you're describing. I know that there are platforms that you can use to kind of automate that all for you, but I'm blessed to have someone that works with me that he has it set up in such a way that it's all going to be taken care of through, and it's not unlike the newsletter that I have. You know, I was speaking recently in Orlando, and I told folks there that if you don't have an e-newsletter these days, you're really doing yourself a disservice. And although there are platforms like MailChimp, there's platforms like Constant Contact, my case, my web developer has an e-newsletter built into the website so that I don't have to pay for something like when someone's ordering an ebook, you obviously, especially when it's priced at $4.97, you want to be able to keep as much of that $4.97 as you can.
Right.
Same thing with newsletter. If you're sending out a newsletter every week, which is what I do to promote the podcast, you're not really supposed to sell to everybody in every single newsletter. So by and large, I make mine very informational. So thus, if I was having to pay for a service like MailChimp or Constant Contact or any of the others out there, all of a sudden you're going to really force yourself to say, well, I better get some return on this newsletter that I'm sending out every week because it's costing me to send it. Or what's going to happen is you're going to talk yourself out of the frequency. And now all of a sudden you're selling yourself short because you're not giving yourself as much exposure opportunity.
Excellent. So where's the best place to go to purchase your book?
brucesbonusbook.com. And that's a little trick that I recommend to your listeners, to buy as many URLs as you need, because the trick that you'll notice is brucesbonusbook.com will take you to what essentially is the store on my company website. When people ask me where can they go to hear my podcast, I tell them to go to nhte.net, because the podcast is called Now Hear This Entertainment. But nhte.net merely puts you on the page of my company website where the podcast lives. And if someone just says, what is your company website? Then I tell them it's nowhearthis.biz. And sadly, I always have to tell people that it's HEAR because they tend to spell it another way.
Well,
if you notice, those are all URLs that all end up at the same website. You're just landing on a different page.
Sure.
So I really suggest that people do that, because otherwise, if you're doing an interview like I am now and you say, well, go to nowhearthis.biz and then click on the store button or click on the blog button or click on the podcast button, it's a lot easier. In fact, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now for my podcast, and on the back of the t-shirt, it says www.nhte.net. Now, how would I put a big, long, clumsy URL on the back of a shirt if it was my company website with a slash and then something else, or a directory and then a podcast dot whatever?
Sure.
So a lot cleaner to tell someone my ebook series is available at brucesbonusbook.com, and it's just that simple.
Well, I think that's a great idea, especially for people who are just maybe heard a podcast, or someone, maybe their friend said, oh, you have to check this out. And if you go right to your source, that's probably a good idea, because sometimes when you go to the main web page, just like you said, maybe it's like, oh, this is too much. I'm not trying to find it,
sure.
But if you go send your audience right there, it's great.
The advice that I give to authors is that you have to keep in mind that when you're doing interviews, say on a podcast or on the radio, the overwhelming majority of the time, the listeners are not sitting in front of their computer. They're driving, they're on the treadmill, they're out for a jog. So it has to be something memorable that they can go back to their computer and get to easily later. So, what I happen to like about my podcast URL, nhte.net, is there's N's, E's, and T's in both of those. So the more repetition there is, and the fact that it is a nice, easy acronym that's very short. And if someone's interested in the book series and they just hear brucesbonusbook.com, they're going to remember that, as opposed to when it's a newspaper, when it's a story that's printed on the internet. Of course, it's very easy for them to put whatever your URL is, although it still shouldn't look really long and clumsy. But when you're doing a broadcast interview, and I'm saying audio, meaning radio or podcast, and you're just trusting the listener to literally take home what you said, if they have something that's real simple to remember, if your book is called Tour of America, then your web address should probably be tourofamerica.com, or if that's taken, then tourofamericabook.com.
Sure.
And that way people will remember it when they get back home, so they can look for your book online.
Very good advice.
Excellent tip. So do you have any other tips for people who are interested in writing ebooks?
I'm laughing because a salesman would say yes, and they're all available at Bruce.
Right.
I guess I set that one up for you.
Well, you did, but honestly, Matt, a lot of what I talk about in there is kind of, I don't want to say information that isn't rocket science. What I think it really boils down to is because you do have to wear so many hats when you're a DIYer. And I talk about this in the world of podcasting. I say, we are all so overwhelmed with things like looking at our stats, writing for our next episode, checking out what new equipment is available, going to industry events. And there's this big long list I go to of all these things that we're all so bogged down with that podcasters tend to kind of put promoting to the side, and they kind of feel that once they release their episode, it's like build it and they will come. Well, there's 400,000 podcasts on iTunes, or at least there were as of last August. So just because your podcast is there, I don't care how good your show art looks, I don't care how catchy the title is, all of a sudden it is 1 in 400,000. They all quote unquote look the same in terms of the same real estate. So you really do need to do something, and I should say something's plural, to make yours stand out. How will people know about your podcast? And it's the same thing with a book. So the tips that I give out in my book, yes, at episode 211, I'm still able to give tips out to people because there's so much that people are missing out on. There's so much that people can do. And some of it boils down to the simple things that we've talked about so far during this interview, because I do see people making these mistakes where they're giving out, as I was saying a few minutes ago, a long, clumsy URL. If I told people to go to a website that had my last name in the URL, I'd never a big, long Polish last name like that, you can imagine how often it's misspelled. So these are the things that I observe, and I do deal with a lot of clients. I do deal with a lot of people that I'm doing business with, that a lot of it is having the promotional background that I have, having worked in professional sports for so many years, and then just kind of seeing what people are doing, that especially the people that complain to me, Matt and Leah, because they're not getting the opportunities that they want. And then I look at what they're doing, and it's almost like a doctor diagnosing, well, this is why you feel sick. I look at it and I say, for instance, the story that I always like to use is a guy that called me up and wanted me to get more bookings for his band, which, authors can relate to this because authors all want book signings.
Sure.
So, this guy in this band, I looked at his website, and mind you, the only social media that his band had was Facebook. That's it. So on neither the website nor the Facebook did they have any audio or any video. So I called him back and I said, I looked at your online presence, and how are clubs supposed to know what your band sounds like if you don't have any audio or any video?
Yeah. Good point.
And he said, well, you just tell them that we're good. We're a bunch of guys. We've been playing together for 20 years, Bruce. And I said, listen, I'm sure you are good. I said, but they're not going to just take my word on it.
Right.
So it's the same thing for an author. You have to be, as we were talking about before, in a lot of different places, because you put your work out there and you're proud of it and you know that your book is good. But unfortunately, like we said earlier about publishers, now the burden is on you to let people know. And I will give your listeners this tip. So when you're trying to get media interviews, there has to be a hook. And the example that I point to is if you watch the 6 o'clock or the 11 o'clock news, you'll notice that right before they throw it to a commercial, they'll give a teaser that really makes you hang on. And that cliffhanger is what keeps you tuned to their newscast until they come back after the commercial break. Mm-hmm. So when you're pitching anyone, whether it's newspaper, television, radio, podcast, an internet site, you have to have something really compelling, because if your whole pitch is, my name is John Doe and I've written this book called Tour of America, so what? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what? Why should I devote space in my newspaper? Why should I book you as a guest on my show? What are you going to tell my listening audience that's going to help them, that is going to be different from the guy who I'm going to talk to after I hang up with this call that wants me to put him on because he's an author? So it really has to be something that grabs someone and is quote unquote newsworthy.
Mm-hmm. You need a catch. Exactly.
And does your business Now Hear This help promote other people's books?
Yes. For instance, I have an author that you had on your show, Deborah Yates, who wrote a book called Woman of Many Names about her 7th great-grandmother. And so, that's an example there of where if you go back to the example that I just used, the guy who wanted me to book his band, I don't work with bands, with performers on a booking only basis, because I want to be involved with all of my clients in terms of helping tell their story, build their brand. And so if all I'm able to tell people is this band has performed at a lot of clubs for 20 years, they're going to say a lot of bands have done that. And so with someone like Deborah, when I can go in and I can speak almost as though I wrote the book myself and say, this is her 7th great grandmother, and she had ties to Daniel Boone and George Washington. And some of her letters were later found in Thomas Jefferson's effects. All of a sudden, this person that I'm pitching to is going, wow, tell me more, and
Sure.
That's what you want the person to say is tell me more. So that's why I have to be that involved with my clients, because they're expecting results from me. Can you get me book signings? Can you get me interviews? These types of things. So the only way I can do that is to know their book as well as they can educate me so that I can represent them well. Because what happens is we get too attached to our own work. And unfortunately, you do realize very quickly that there's a whole lot of no's in this business, but it makes the yeses that much more meaningful because you're persistent. I like to say that with Now Hear This, that my company has a 4 P's approach, which is patient, polite, professional, but persistent. And so it really makes it easier to deal with those no's because there's always going to be another opportunity. You just want to start raising that batting average eventually so that you're getting more yeses. But I can kind of let them slide off my back because I know I'm just going to move on to the next one. Whereas an author herself is going to kind of take it personally and say, maybe this person doesn't understand the time and the effort, the blood, sweat, and tears that I've invested into this book. They do. They're just getting so many calls. They're getting so many emails. They're getting so many unsolicited mail every day that they just can't say yes to everybody. So it's really that pitch that has to be so compelling that they're going to say yes to Now Hear This and to whichever client I'm pitching them.
Now Hear This. I love that. How did you come up with that?
I'm glad you asked me that because with the exception of an interview that I actually just uploaded to the Now Hear This YouTube channel, I really don't get asked that question very much at all. So thank you for asking that. When I first founded the company, it was based on, I had just moved to the greater Tampa Bay area in April of 2002. And in going to church every Sunday, there was a girl whose voice I just fell in love with. And so finally, one week I asked her, do you sing outside of church? And she said, yeah, here and there. And I offered to help her out and told her what my background was. And right away, she got defensive and said, no, my dad helps me with all this. Well, her dad was a realtor. He didn't have a background.
Oh.
And so I just thought more people need to hear the talent that this girl has. Oh. So the more they started letting me help them, the more results I started delivering. And all of a sudden, I realized I could make a business out of this. And I thought, I want to tell people about these clients that they need to hear. So there's kind of a double meaning on that. It's, I want your attention because I want to tell you something. So hear what I have to say, which is going to be hear this person's performance or hear this person's story. If it's an author, hear about the message that they have in their book. Or even I've worked with small businesses, hear about this business and their services. So it's kind of Now Hear This with a double meaning. Hear me first, because I want to tell you about someone that you really need to hear about.
That's excellent. Matt, that's the kind of stuff you like, right? The double meaning.
I do love that. Yeah, that is a great story. I was listening to every word.
It's a very good story.
Excellent. So Bruce, is there anything that we didn't cover so far that you think might be important?
Well, I will give another tip here, and that is people will get confused and they'll say, so your podcast is Now Hear This. And I say, no, it's Now Hear This Entertainment. You have to have that fourth word. And they say, oh, well, same thing. No, it's not. And here's the thing. You need to do your research on things like your domain name, as we talked about before, on something like when I was ready to start the podcast, I thought, well, I'd like to just call it Now Hear This. But and Matt and Leah, this is not rocket science, what I'm about to say. I went onto iTunes and I typed in Now Hear This because I thought, well, I better check first to make sure that there's no other podcasts out there by that name. And there was. Oh. So I thought, well, I know that what I'm going to do every week is I'm going to interview guests who are having success in entertainment, primarily music. So what if I just called it Now Hear This Entertainment? Is anyone using that? No, they weren't. So that's how I came up with the name. So in some of these cases, and if you really want to do some advanced planning, then you do start saying, okay, let's see, what would I do for a web domain? And then start researching, are those available? Maybe you go as deep as, what about social media? Am I going to be able to get the same handle across all the different platforms? So, with my podcast, anytime you hear me talk about it, you're always going to hear me saying all 4 words, or I'm going to refer to it as NHTE. In fact, if your listeners go and look on the Instagram account for my podcast, so on Instagram, it's at Now Hear This Entertainment, you'll see that in celebration of the 4-year anniversary this past weekend, I went to a bakery and I had them do 4 letters, 4 cupcakes, 4 years. So there's 4 cupcakes. Each one has a different letter on top of it, N, H, T, and E. But those are kind of some of the gimmicks, because a lot of people will say, well, Bruce, I don't have anything to post. I don't know. I can't put anything up today on social media. It's like a client of mine. I would tell her, we're due for a new article on the homepage of your website. And she'd say, well, I don't have anything going on. And it's kind of like that old Seinfeld episode with her. Write the pilot and said, what'd you do today?
Nothing.
That's And so she would say to me, well, I don't have anything going on. I don't know what we could put as a homepage article. And I'd say, you've got stuff going on. Let me work on it and I'll email it to you. And then I would send her something. So in the case of these cupcakes, I thought, well, I know what my social media post is going to be on Saturday. It's going to be a picture of the cupcakes. Okay. So I think sometimes we overthink these things because we feel like it's this gorilla that we have to try to slay. And in fact, it could be something as simple as cupcakes. And, you really need to kind of shift to a millennial mindset and look at what some of the kids are posting these days, because to them, everything is a show, to use that Seinfeld analogy. There's posts that I see that the millennials put, and I think, big deal. Well, so what? Mm-hmm. But to them and that age group, it's something. So we really don't have to overthink these things. It could be, hey, that's pretty cool. He's got cupcakes that he had made up.
Sure.
4 cupcakes, 4 letters, 4 years.
Okay, excellent.
Right.
Excellent.
That's very good, because we struggle with what to post on our Facebook page too. You don't want to put something on there that you think that someone's going to say, they're just wasting my time with that. But I see exactly what you mean. If I scrolled by, I saw those cool cupcakes that are blue and white. I'm like, hey,
they what's that?
They look delicious. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, and Matt, to your point about they're wasting my time, if you were trying to sell to people in every single social media post, I would be turned off and I'd say, you're wasting my time. You just keep trying to sell to me in every post. But if you're just putting up information or entertaining posts, if someone says you're wasting time, well, that person probably needs an attitude adjustment, because you're not wasting their time. You're just keeping a presence out there, which is so important. You just have to maintain that consistent presence on social media. And yes, eventually you're going to have to, every once in a while, drop in something where you're asking for the sale, as long as it's not 5 days a week, 7 days a week.
Right. Like jab, 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 right hook. Right. Gary Vee's book.
There you go.
Well, thank you. You are a wealth of information.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah.
It was great talking to you. So thanks for coming on The Author Inside You today. It was wonderful having you as a guest.
Absolutely. And I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage your listeners to check out brucesbonusbook.com for the ebook series, and or to go to nhte.net to listen to the podcast.
Thank you again, Bruce, for joining us on the Author Inside You podcast.
And if you get a chance, stop over on Facebook and join our Facebook group.
Until next time.
Right on.
Thank you for listening to the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.